Welcome to the Serious Deficiency and Suspension Template Letter and Process Training for sponsors of family daycare homes hosted by the Oregon Department of Education Child Nutrition Programs. This training will provide an overview of the serious deficiency and suspension process, how to access the template letters, and the situations when each serious deficiency or suspension letter will be issued. During this training, ODE CMP will provide instructions on how to access the revised serious deficiency and suspension letters, provide an overview of the serious deficiency and suspension flowcharts, review the changes in the serious deficiency and suspension process, and allow time for questions and answers. Per the ODE CMP memo issued January 11, 2016, ODE CMP revised the serious deficiency and suspension template letters. The letters were revised to be more in line with the USDA templates published in the Serious Deficiency, Suspension, and Appeals for State Agencies and Sponsoring Organizations Handbook. The letters and flowcharts are available on the ODE CMP Google Drive at the link on the screen. It's recommended to bookmark the link for easy reference. Instructions on how to access and download the letters were enclosed with the memo. Let's go to the Google Drive and download a letter. To download a letter or the flowcharts, first click on the link. After clicking on the link, you'll be taken directly to the letters. All letters are labeled with the appropriate title. Double-click on the image of the letter you would like to download. The letter you selected will open in view-only mode. Click on the download icon to download the letter. Save the letter to your internal folder or flash drive. Then open the letter from your internal folder or flash drive. Click Enable Content and you may begin working in the document. ODE CMP may update letters on an as-needed basis, therefore it's important you download the letters directly from the Google Drive each time you send a letter. All translations of each letter are also available in the Google Drive in separate folders. When a provider is determined to be seriously deficient, you must issue Letter 1, which is the Notice of Serious Deficiency. It's important not to wait to get the letter out to the provider. Issue the letter once a serious deficiency is determined. When issuing the letter, be sure to simultaneously send the letter to ODE CMP to ode.communitynutrition@ode.state.or.us. Your assigned child nutrition specialist will review all letters as you submit them. If any changes are necessary and the letter needs to be reissued, your specialist will contact you. In addition, you must also immediately submit a revised provider info sheet for the affected provider and enter the serious deficiency determination date. I will take you to CMP Web and show you where you will include the date. First, log into CMP Web. Click on the appropriate year, then select Applications. Locate the provider Jane Doe and click Revise. Enter the date in the Serious Deficiency Determination Date field, which is item 8. It's imperative that the date matches the date on the letter. Once entered, scroll to the bottom of the screen, check the checkbox and click Submit. The revised provider info sheet will update into a pending approval status. This will trigger your assigned specialist to review the revised provider info sheet and compare the date to the letter. Your specialist will contact you if any changes are necessary. Once the provider info sheet is accurate and complete, the specialist will approve the revised sheet. Now let's go back to the flowchart. The next step in the process revolves around the corrective action. Did the provider submit corrective action? If yes, review and determine if the corrective action fully and permanently corrected the serious deficiency. If yes, issue Letter 2 to both the provider and ODE CMP. Again, you will submit a revised provider info sheet for the affected provider. This time, however, you will enter the serious deficiency temporarily deferred date, which is item 9, in the revised provider info sheet. Again, the date must match the date on the letter. Once entered, scroll to the bottom of the screen and click Submit. Now go back to the flowchart to review other corrective action scenarios. If you determine the corrective action submitted by the provider does not fully and permanently correct the serious deficiencies, then you would issue Letter 3, the Notice of Proposed Termination and Proposed Disqualification. There are 5 different letters for Letter 3. Issue Letter 3A if corrective action was received before the deadline. However, you have determined that the corrective action does not fully and permanently correct the serious deficiencies. Issue Letter 3B if corrective action was received before the deadline. However, during an unannounced follow-up review, you determine that the corrective action does not adequately correct the serious deficiencies. Issue Letter 3C if corrective action was received after the corrective action deadline. Issue Letter 3D if corrective action was not received. Issue Letter 3E if corrective action was received before the deadline and is determined the corrective action is fully and permanently corrects the serious deficiencies. However, during a subsequent visit, the serious deficiencies were not fully and permanently corrected. As a reminder, the serious deficiency and suspension process letter template instructions will inform you in which each situation each letter will be issued. Issue Letter 4, Notice of Termination and Disqualification. If the provider does not submit a request for an appeal, then you must issue Letter 4 to terminate and disqualify. Like Letter 3, there are different letters for Letter 4. Issue Letter 4A if the provider did not request an appeal by the appeal deadline and documentation is available that Letter 3 was received by the provider. Issue Letter 4B if the provider did not request an appeal and documentation is not available that Letter 3 was received by the provider. If the notice is undeliverable, USDA considers the letter to be received by the provider 5 days after being sent to the addressee's last known mailing address, fax number, or email address. As you did for Letter 1 and Letter 2, you will submit a revised provider info sheet in CMP Web. Locate the provider and click Revise. In this situation, you will enter the CACFP termination date and the termination reason. The date and reason must match the letter. Be sure to also uncheck months of operation that are after the termination month. Once entered, scroll to the bottom and click Submit. Once reviewed and approved by your specialist, the provider info sheet will update to a terminated status. If the provider does not submit a request for an appeal, you will issue either Letter 5 or Letter 6, depending on the outcome of the appeal. If the provider prevails, issue Letter 5. If you prevail, issue Letter 6. If the provider prevails, you will need to submit a revised provider info sheet and enter the serious deficiency temporarily deferred date. If you prevail, you will need to submit a revised provider info sheet and enter the CACFP termination date and the termination reason. Now let's review the suspension process. On this slide is the suspension flowchart. The flowchart is available on the Google Drive. The top of the flowchart includes when to issue each specific letter. The bottom of the flowchart includes the process when issuing each specific letter. We will briefly review each step in the process, then review when each letter should be issued. When you establish a health or safety threat, or you receive notification from the Office of Child Care that a provider has been suspended, you must immediately issue Letter 7, the Notice of Serious Deficiency, Suspension, and Proposed Termination and Disqualification. Just as you did for Letter 1, you must submit a revised provider info sheet and include the Serious Deficiency determination date. The date must match the date included in the letter. If the provider does not submit a request for an appeal, then you must issue Letter 8, Notice of Termination and Disqualification. Just as you did for Letter 4, you will submit a revised provider info sheet in CMP Web and enter the CACFP termination date and termination reason. The date and the reason must match the letter. If the provider does submit a request for an appeal, you will issue either Letter 9 or Letter 10, depending on the outcome of the appeal. If you prevail, issue Letter 9, Notice of Termination and Disqualification. If the provider prevails, issue Letter 10, Notice of Rescission of Suspension, Proposed Termination, and Disqualification. If the provider prevails, you need to submit a revised provider info sheet and enter the Serious Deficiency temporarily deferred date. If you prevail, you need to submit a revised provider info sheet and enter the CACFP termination date and the termination reason. Please note, if the provider prevails in the appeal, the serious deficiency still needs to be addressed. The provider must submit corrective action. Issue Letter 2 or Letter 3 based on the evaluation of the corrective action. As a reminder, all letters must be sent to the provider and ODE CMP simultaneously. All letters must be sent to ode.communitynutrition@ode.state.or.us. In addition, CMP Web must be updated throughout the process. To update CMP Web, submit a revised provider info sheet for the affected provider with the appropriate dates. The dates entered in CMP Web must match the respective letters. Thank you for participating in the Serious Deficiency and Suspension Template Letter and Process Training for sponsors of family daycare homes. If you have any questions, please contact your assigned child nutrition specialist. We greatly appreciate the work that you do to fuel Oregon's future.